volume you have, well, I don't know if you have Arch, but if you have a standard Shas, we're going to be going through all of the remaining small Masechtas that are bundled in this one volume, Taanit, Megillah, Moed Katan, and Chagiga. So we'll be doing now, we already sort of started with Rosh Hashanah, but about a Masechet a month for 4 more months till we finish Moed. And Taanit, as the title indicates, obviously focuses on the issues of fasting. But besides the fasting, what should be, first of all, when we say fast, our initial thoughts are about what I would call the historical fasts, the fasts to commemorate, tragedies in the past on particular dates. These are actually ones that are reflected, by, in the when the people come back after, after the exile, they say, should we continue to fast like we've been fasting? Should we continue to fast as we've been fasting before? And then Navi says back to them, that these days will be with Sasolu, with Simcha, with the rebuilding of a temple. These things which had been fast days will return into days of joy and so on. We actually discussed some of that in Rosh Hashanah when we discussed the issue of Megillat Taanit. So while on the one hand, that is something that is very much indicate primary in our mindset when we think about fast days, and indicated already, like in the Nevi'im, as the first record that there were very particular dates that they would fast. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, that's of a very secondary concern to this Masechet. And this Masechet really is the issue is fasting as a response to tragedy or impending tragedy, specifically around the issue of the lack and absence of rain. As such, by the way, if one looks at the Tefillah of Shlomo when he's building the Beit HaMikdash and he talks about why people will turn to God, one of the central things that he says in his tefillah is if there is no rain and they will direct their prayers to you in this place. Or if he says, or if there's a tragedy and there is and there is locusts and there is famine and there's this, they will direct their prayers to you in this place. This would be the common reason why people would pray to God, because it's not raining and you're concerned that all the crops are going to, go to waste and there'll be famine in the year. There's some other tragedy. If you're living in an agricultural society, certainly people have the same types of concerns we have about illness and so on, but the more sort of like recurring reason why your life feels precarious and you're not certain about the future and you turn to God is because of the things that are happening with the agriculture, infestations and so on, and there will also be wild animals at that time, but also the rain is the regular type of a thing, is a regular reason that you turn to God, and as such, it's important to think about this Masechet when we think about it, not just as about fasting, but to think about it almost in a counterpart in the way we'll sort of see this on the first daf to like Masechet Brachot. Masechet Brachot is like fixed liturgy, right? So, you have the Shema, you have the Shemona Esrei. It's not responding to any particular event that occurred. While to some degree, the Shemona Esrei is 3 times a day because, according to the Yerushalmi and other sort, whatever, other hints that it's basically about the different places in which the sun is. The sun rises, it evokes a certain type of a feeling. The sun is setting, it evokes a different, night evokes a different type of a feeling. But nevertheless, those are natural rhythms of the day, even if they're somehow responding to a different type of an emotional state during, in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, but it's basically a fixed type of a liturgy. To the degree in Brachot you get a type of a liturgy or a type of a religious response to more periodic occurrences or to more sort of immediate things that are occurring, and responding to the change of situations, you get in the Birchot HaShevach. So like you see the thunder and the lightning, you see the trees blossoming, or just something good happens and you say Shechianu, and something bad happens and you say Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. That you get at the very end of Brachot. Here, this maybe in some way can be seen as picking up that theme, or I would more say contrasting the basic liturgy, the fixed liturgy, and this is the basic point about, a religious response to what's occurring in a person's life. Now, obviously, the central thing here is about the rain and tragedy. It's about bad things, not good things, but in that way, this Masechet is very much about, is very sort of, I would say, the Masechet that's most focused on this type of a, what it means means to sort of see God in the world, or see God, see sort of the absence of God, or God punishing, or and sort of the need to call out to God, to respond to that, and to try to pray for God's kindness, or pray for God's more greater presence in the world. And so this is really a Masechet that deals a lot with the religious response to one's circumstances and to a very type of a religious engagement with the world. I would say more than any other Masechet, which much more, I mean, obviously our entire, life is religious, but it's much more tends to be about ritual and structure and, fixed. And this also becomes fixed, but it nevertheless is very much about a response to seeing God's presence or feeling God's presence or absence in the world, and how one responds. And in that way, I think it's very important to think about what the basic theme of this Masechet is, and not to just automatically think, it's about how you fast days. I mean, the fast is one profound response, and I think it is worth thinking about the idea about, why is it called Masechet Taanit? Taanit is not mentioned in the first Mishnah. The first Mishnah is going to mention aspects of the davening, and one of the responses, of course, when there's no rain during the fast day, is a whole separate special set of prayers, right? So tefillot also change during the fast day, but nevertheless, it's the prayers you say during the fast day, and the primary way the nature of the day changes is that the day becomes a fast day. But it does also do something when we think about that as that dominates. What's the religious response to absence of rain, or to, infestation or whatever? You fast. As opposed to say, well, there's a couple things you do. You fast, you pray, you do tshuva, right? So the dominant theme here becomes fasting, and that also shapes a particular perception. But again, it's important, I think, to start by just saying this is not just like, how do we do various ta'aniyot? It fundamentally starts with this issue about a religious engagement in the world, in a sense of a religious response to things that are happening to us. Yeah, you had a question.
I can understand a lot of responses to tragedy. Why is a religious response to tragedy fasting? Fasting is self-denial.
Right.
What's the connection between?
Right. So that is an excellent question. And again, if you go back to, like I said, like the prayer by Shlomo, where he dedicates the Beit Hamikdash, there he talks about the primary reason people will pray will because of these terrible things, and they'll direct their prayers. Right. So in a sense, you had like prayer by itself, although there again it was much more shevach than bad things. To the degree it was bad, it was Baruch Dayan Hamet, which is about the past, not about the praying for the future. So there you had it in brachot. So again, that's exactly a point I want us to be thinking about, that framing it the way I did raises the question. So if that's what this is about, why is Ta'anit the dominant theme, and what is the religious value of Ta'anit? So keep that question in mind. That's a question I want us to be reflecting on as we go through the Masechet. Okay, was there another question? No? Okay, so let's take a look. Let me maybe just take one more second and just read the psukim by Shlomo that I've been referring to. I can find them quickly. And then just to give you a sense how this is a theme that plays out.
It's a huge chapter.
I know. Which parak is it? You remember?
8.
Lachim Bet 8?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So guys, what is it, like 75, 16 in that parak?
No, Lachim Bet is too late. It's Malachim Aleph. 8, I'm sorry. Oh, you're right. So listen to this. Okay, here's what Shlomo says why people will pray us. He's dedicating the Beis Hamikdash. He says, "Ufanita tefillas avdecha vel tchinato Hashem Elokai lishma l'rina vel tefillah shavdecha mitpalel lefanecha hayom. L'yon teinech ptuchot al habayit hazeh laila v'yom." Right? Asher yitpalel avdecha l'makom hazeh. So you'll always be hearing the prayers. V'shamata el tchinat avdecha v'amcha Yisrael asher yitpalelu. Now, what are they going to pray? So he says, okay, so first of all, somebody gets a curse, so you're going to be responsive to that. Then, right after that, ושבו אליך והודו את שמך, ואתה תשמע השמיים וסלחת. ויצר השמיים ולא יהיה מטר, ואתה תשמע השמיים וסלחת. רעב כי יהיה בארץ, דבר כי יהיה, שיטפון ירקון, הרבה חסיל כי יהיה, כי יצא לו אויבו בארץ שעריו. כל תפילה, כל תחינה אשר תהיה לכל אדם, לכל עמך ישראל, אשר ידון איש ניגו לבבו, פרס כפיו אל הבית הזה. So of those things, it's basically tragedy. Lack of rain is one of them, but all the other types of things that could happen. Rav, shidafon, chasil, right, infestation, famine. So that is all about prayer. What in our Masechet, what that becomes is the basis for ta'aniyot. Yes.
Just to say that the refrain in what you read was
Yes.
V'salachta.
V'salachta.
So tragedy is being conceptualized biblically as a punishment for some type of human shortcoming
Right. I
or
think
sin. So there's a requirement for forgiveness, as it were.
so. Thank
So
you.
you still can ask that question, but now fasting gets tied into that conceptualization.
I thank you very much. That's an excellent point, and that's also a theme that we're going to see, right? It's not just like a prayer for compassion, like we need you, please give it to us, but a sense that if this is happening, it's because of sin. And then the issue of fasting becomes, is to connect, if in our mind would connect to, is that related to Yom Kippur? To what degree is fasting something of a way of, of not either tshuva or a way of, look, we're punishing ourselves and therefore we've been suffered, so therefore we should be forgiven. But I think Dov makes it the excellent point that yes, it's prayer, but also when there's a sense of, of tragedy or bad things, there's a sense of sin and a need to be forgiven. And that's also something we have to think about as we go through this Masechet. Yes.
Agricultural productivity is specifically mentioned in the Shema as being a function of our actions.
Excellent. And that we're going to see on the first half. So that's enough for Hakdama. But again, these are really important themes to be thinking about, that we don't just go into the mindset of fasting. Okay, so let's take a look at the first Mishnah. Me'ematai opens the same way Brachot opens. Me'ematai maskin gvurat geshamim. When do you start mentioning the power of the rain? Mashiv haruach morid hageshem. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Miyom Tov Harishon Shel Chag, starting on the first day of Sukkot, the simple sense of Chag by itself means Sukkot, because that's a period of rain, as we know, as we'll see. You wave lulav and esro, you do the Nisu Chamayim. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, Miyom Tov Achron Shel Chag, no, only on the last day of Sukkot. Now that would sound like it means the 7th of Sukkot. It's possible it means after the last day, starting after Sukkot is over, on Shemini Atzeret. Amalo Rabbi Yoshua said to him, since the rain is really only a sign of curse on the Chag, why does he say that? Presumably because of the Mishnah in Sukkot, which says that if it rains on Sukkot, it's like a person is coming to serve the water to his master, and the master takes the jug of water and throws it on the servant. So we're trying to sit in the Sukkah and do a mitzvah, and God is driving us out of the Sukkah with the rain. So it is a siman of displeasure. If rain happens on Sukkot, of God's displeasure with us. Lama hu maskir. Why would you mention Mashiv Baruch Morid Gershom if you don't want it to rain yet on Sukkot? So Amalo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said back, Afani lo amarti lishol el lahazkir. I didn't say to start asking. You don't start saying v'tein talumat halivracha. You don't start requesting from God that it should rain. You only are maskir. You mention that God brings the rain. You're mentioning the powers of God, but you're not. It's not a specific request that it begin now. So Mashiv Haruach Umarid Hageshem Be'onato. You cause the wind to blow and the rain to fall in its right time. By the way, this whole thing of Mashiv Haruach, we sort of gloss over that. I was reading something last night about how that this is very true in Eretz Yisrael, that before these serious rains comes, it's preceded with very heavy winds. I don't know. But anyway, something to look into. So Amar Lo, so he said, look, I'm not asking for it to come now, I'm just mentioning it. So Amar Lo, so Rabbi Yoshua said back to him, In Cain, if that's true, so L'olam Yehi Mazkir. So you should mention it the whole year. Why do you only mention it now? Obviously you're mentioning it now because you want it now, but if you're saying now because you want it now, then you shouldn't say it till after Sukkot is over. Okay, we don't have a response. We'll see a response in the Gemara. Okay, so now, Ein Sholim et Geshamim, since we mentioned the idea that there's not only mentioning the rain, but there's asking, Tein Talu Matali Vracha, that you only do Ela Samuch Geshamim, near when you actually is the time of rain. So you don't even do that even right after Sukkot. You only start really requesting it when the time is coming, when it really is the time you're expecting it to rain. And we'll see what that time is later. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, so this is a little bit strange, the order of the Mishnah, because we're mentioning Mashkiv Baruch Morid Hageshem, then we mention Ein Shoalim, the issue about Shoalim, Tein Talumatar, and then we go back to finishing up the discussion of Mashiv Baruch Morid Hageshem. We have a brief mention of Tein Talumatar without expanding it, and now we're going back to Mashiv Haruach. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ha'over Lifnei HaTeiva B'Yom Tov Ha'achron Shel Chag, Acharon maskir, harishon eino maskir. Here's when you do say Mashiv Haruach and when you don't. The person who goes before the ark, meaning the Baal Tefillah, the Shliach Tzibor, the last day of Sukkot. So this means the last day, and it's Yantav, meaning it's not Sukkot, it's Shmini Atzeret. So Acharon maskir, the second person, the Baal Musaf says Mashiv Haruach. Harishon, the Baal Shachri, say no maskir. So you say it at Musaf, you start saying it Musaf and Shmini Atzeret. Yom Tov Harishon Shal Pesach. Now, it's the first day of Pesach, Harishon Maskir, the Baal Shachri says it. Acharon Eino Maskir, the Baal Musaf stops saying it. Okay, so this is exactly what we do. We say Mashi Baruch Mordei Geshem from Musaf of Shmini Atzeres through Shacharis of Pesach. Now, what he's really doing is a subtly different position than Rabbi Yoshua. First of all, you don't know by Rabbi Yoshua when you stop saying Mashi Baruch. So he clarifies you stop saying it. But on the first day of Pesach. It's also subtly different because Rabbi Yoshua says you start saying it after the last day of Sukkot. So according to Rabbi Yoshua, presumably you say it the night of Shmini Atzeres, or maybe Shachris of Shmini Atzeres. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda is creating a much clearer structure. It's from Musaf until the next Musaf. No, you don't start saying it the morning of Shmini Atzeres, you stay at the Musaf of Shmini Atzeres, and that goes all the way up to, but not including, the Musaf of Pesach. And we'll see why in the Gemara. So again, this is the first Mishnah, is pretty much all about saying Mashiv Baruch Morid Hashem. Nothing bad has happened yet. This is a normal year. You're just expecting things to happen, God willing, normally. You're not even yet at the point of asking yet. You're just mentioning God's power of Mashiv Baruch Morid Hashem. Right? No anxiety has yet come into the picture. And the only question is, when do you start? The only reason for the insertion of Ein Sholim El Samuch Geshamim, the asking of Tein Talumatar, since we're going to expand on that in a later Mishnah, is for the sake of clarifying the debate of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Because Rabbi Yoshua sort of says, they were discussing, hey, you don't ask, why are you mentioning it's not the right time? And he's saying, well, there's a difference between mentioning and asking for it. So the Mishnah is sort of like clarifying the asking for it clearly happens later. And Rabbi Eliezer is saying, I'm not yet talking about asking for it. That I admit is going to happen later. I'm talking about the mentioning of it. So it's a little bit discordant, that one line. We're going to really expand the idea of Tein Talamatar, Shoalim, but it was brought here to give a clarification to what these issues are at stake here in terms of the Maskirim. Yes.
We do have in this language also a Mishnaic paradigm for different types of prayer. In other words, we call some types of prayers bakashot, that's mishol.
Right.
They're using the language of lahazkir as to conceptualize the function of prayer as to articulate a consciousness of God.
Okay, so that's a nice idea. I mean, for our own consciousness, right. But Shevach is more the classic, and that's exactly the difference. That Mashiv Baruch Morid Geshem is in the first three, which are seen as Shevach, and Tein Talamatar Livracha are in the middle brachot, which are about Shoalim and Bakashat.
And they use the language that they use, the Mishnah.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. It's a very good point. So let's take a look at the... Yes?
Why are they using Geshem in one phrase and Matar in the other phrase?
So that's a very good point. I have to think about that. I have to get back to you about that. I mean, the Psukim have Geshem, right? V'nasati gishmechem be'itam. Does it have Matar? Matar Shemayim? Yeah, Latate Matar Shemayim. So I don't know exactly whether there's a different connotation between Matar and Geshem. I mean, it doesn't say matar. I was saying when it says maskir, the maskir is tein tal matar livracha. That's what we say in our Shmona Esrei. We say tein tal matar. It's not in the Mishnah, but you're right. When in the Shmona Esrei, we say mashi faruch morid geshem, and then when we ask for it, no, it's not in the Mishnah, but when we ask for it, the maskirin is morid hageshem. The Sharlim is Tein Tal Matar, Livracha. So you're right, in the Shmona Esrei. In the Mishnah, it's referred to as Geshem in both places. All right, let's take a look at the Gemara. Okay, Tana Heichakai, Diktani Me'ematai. What is the frame of reference of the Tana that he's saying, what time do we begin saying? Which means that you assume that you already know you're supposed to say it. How do you know you're supposed to say it? The first Gemara in Brachot asks the same question. The Mishnah opens, when do you say Shema in the evening? And the Gemara says, how do you know you're supposed to say Shema altogether before you can ask when you say it? So it's the same question here. What's your point of reference that you're already assuming you say it, that you're asking when do you begin saying it? So the Gemara says, Tana Hasamkai, Diktani, it's going back to Brachot. In Brachot we say, Maskirin Vurat Geshamim B'tchiyat Tchiyat HaMeitim. You mentioned the power of the Geshem in the Tchiyat HaMeitim, in the second bracha, Mechayei Meitim. For Shoalim, you have the request for it. So there's again that language of Mazkirin and Shoalim. But Birchat Hashanim, in the bracha of the years, right? Of Barech Aleinu et Hashana Hazot, right? The Havdalah, B'chonein Hadad. And you mentioned and Havdalah when it's Motzei Shabbos or Motzei Yom Tov in the fourth bracha of Chonein Hadad. So it mentions the different types of insertions you make in Shemona Es, right? That's a Mishnah there in Brachot. Viktani, so since we mentioned way back in Brachot that you'll add various things in the Shemona Esrei around the rain, so this Mishnah is coming to clarify that Mishnah. So therefore this Mishnah is coming to clarify it. So the Gemara says, if that's true, it's coming to clarify a Mishnah way back in Brachot. Listening also. So talk about it over there when you're supposed to make those insertions. Why are you waiting until now? Ella, rather, Tanam Rosh Hashanah Sali. He's departing from the Masechet of Rosh Hashanah like we just did. He just finished learning Rosh Hashanah, which is the Masechet that comes before this. And what did we teach in Rosh Hashanah? Ubechag Nidonim Alamayim. That on Sukkot is the time that we're judged for water. So, if we're judged for water, you have to discuss how do you respond to that fact that it's a day, that it's a judgment, and that we want we want to pray for that it should be good rains for the coming year. So if it's once we talk that, so we're going to start talking about mentioning Mashi Baruch Moed Geshem as a way of responding to this fact that it is the time of rain and the time of din about rain. So the Gemara says, 1 minute, if that's true, I'm sorry. Why does it say gvurot geshamim? Just say when you start mentioning rain. What's the use of the word gvurot? My gvurot. What does it mean by the powers of rain? So Amar Rabbi Yochanan sheyordin bigvura, because they come down through God's might. Shenemar, how do we see this? So now we're going to have a whole string of psukim to get us to the idea that the idea of gvura is connected to the idea of rain. Shenemar, the verse says, God does wonders without understanding, beyond comprehension, and wondrous things without number. God gives the rain on the face of the earth and sends water towards the fields. My mashma. So where do you get from that the idea that rain is associated with gvura? So Amar Rabbi Bar Shila Asya Cheker Cheker Mibiyasar Shalom. So there you have that God's greatnesses are described as beyond comprehension. Ein Cheker. And in somewhere the same context, although if you look at the side, it's 4 prakim earlier. But okay, somewhere in the same context, we have a mention of rain. So somehow rain there is connected with the idea of being beyond comprehension. All right. So let's keep on going. V'ksiv hasam. Now that we have this word ein cheker, it says over there in Yeshayahu, "Halo yadatim lo shamata Elohei olam Hashem." God is the God of the world. Borei ketzot haaretz, creates the extremities of the land. Lo yiyaf v'lo yigad, is not wearied and does not tire. Ein cheker litvunato. There is no understanding; it's beyond comprehension. God's wisdom, God's understanding. V'ksiv, and it says, so makin harim b'kocho ne'ezar bigvura. So that pasuk in Yeshayahu is about Briyat Olam. Borei ketzot haaretz. So the act of Briyat Olam is connected with the idea of beyond comprehension. And another pasuk in Tehillim, which talks about Briyat Olam, says, Makin harim b'kocho ne'ezar b'gvura. God smites the mountains with his strength. He girds himself with gevura. So it's a very stringing of psukim. We have psukim in Yeshayahu that talks about Briyat Olam, which is beyond comprehension, ein cheker. We have a psukim in Tehillim that in the context of Briyat Olam is associated with an idea of gevura, of God's power. So now we have Briyat Olam is associated with God's power. Then we have the psukim in Iyov that talk about the rain and connect the rain with beyond comprehension. So we import the idea of God's gvura to now apply to regular about the rain. Very convoluted to get this idea of rain going on here. But what are we doing here? Now Tosfos, by the way, says there's a lot of other verbs that are used here. Koach, what was the other here? Kocho, Nezah. Anyway, so if you take a look, Tosfos basically says the real reason we're focusing on this word gevurah. If you take a look at Tosfos, so he goes on, he says there's a lot of other things. The line starts with the word lahakshot, about 8 lines before the lines get wide. So he says, Inami, the last 2 lines of this Tosfos, Mishum dehabracha matcheles bigvura, lahachi nacha gvura, which is really the reason that everybody says, which is that it's gvurat geshamim because it is, how does the bracha begin? Where we mention it in. Ata Gibor Leolam Hashem. So it's mentioned in the bracha of Givurot. We also call it the bracha of Tkiyat Hamidin, but it's the bracha of Givurot. So we are calling this Givurot Geshamim. So all the Gemara is saying is that's an appropriate term to use by Geshamim, the concept of Givurah, but it occurs in the bracha of Givurot, which is really why it is called that. Now I want to say some things about the Gemaras we just read. First of all, the question of are we responding to the Mishnah in Brachot, which says, when do you make insertions in Shemona Esrei? Responding to the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah that says it's a time of Yom Hadin. Now, first of all, just an interesting sort of bibliographical point. Rashi and Tosfos say, well, we'd rather be referring to Rosh Hashanah, which is in the same Seder Moed, as opposed to Brachos, which is in Seder Zra'im. They don't say the more obvious thing, which is, as we know by having done the Daf Yomi, that Rosh Hashanah came right before this Masechet. Mm-hmm. So it's not just it's in the same Seder, like immediately preceded this Masechet, and often the Gemara says, well, this is coming because of the immediately preceding Masechet. So I haven't done any research on this, I don't know the scholarship on it, but I do wonder if our organization that we have, like Rosh Hashanah Yom HaSukkah, which has been reorganized in order to make it chronological, right? First you have Rosh Hashanah, then Yom Kippur. If that was already the organization that was in the time of the Rishonim, because if they had the organization of the original organization of the Mishnah, like we know by having done the Daf Yomi, right, Rashi and Tosfos would have said, well, of course you want to refer back to Rosh Hashanah. It was the immediately previous Masechet, not just it's the same Seder. That's just a bibliographical point. But back to this issue of what's our frame of reference. In a way, this raises this question about, and it can be seen as the debate of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, right? Rabbi Yehoshua says, you don't start mentioning Mashif HaRuach until you want the rain. So for Rabbi Yehoshua, Mashif HaRuach is a prelude to asking about it. But it's all about getting around to asking for it. So maybe you stay Mashif HaRuach a little bit earlier, you stay at Shmini Atzeret, you don't start asking for it until, Mar Cheshvan or December, 4th or 5th if you're in Chutz La'aretz. But the way you build up to asking for it is first you start praising God, Mashif HaRuach Moed HaGeshem, and then we're going to get around to asking for it. But it's all a prelude to asking. That's what Rabbi Yehoshua says, right? So you don't start it unless you're ready for it. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer says, no, maybe it's not related yet to asking, or maybe if it is a prelude, it can come before you're ready to ask, but maybe it's not even related to asking. Maybe it's, if it's the time when rain starts coming, so maybe you start mentioning this as the relevant thing of this time is to acknowledge God as the power of bringing the rain, and it's not necessarily in the context of a request. So in a way, that relates to the question of, are you anchored in Brachot, or are you anchored in Rosh Hashanah? In Brachot, when it says, for example, that you say, Havdalah b'chonin hadas, when you say Havdalah, are you asking for anything? You're not asking for anything. You're making insertions in Shemona Esrei as is appropriate for the day or for the time of the year. So the appropriate insertion in the rainy season is Mashmi Baruch Moed HaGeshem. It doesn't have anything to do with a request. It's the thing we're supposed to be mentioning during this time. That's one way of thinking about it. Maybe that's Rabbi Eliezer who says you can start saying it already at the beginning of the Sukkot. Whereas if your sense is the reason we're talking about rain is because we're nidonin alamayim, and that gets us to the whole point of Taanit, and we want to make sure that we get the rain, and it's a big concern, then the whole mention of Mashmi Baruch Moed HaGeshem is a build-up to that. Well, that's in the context of Rosh Hashanah, of Nidonim Alamayim. And that maybe is Rabbi Yehoshua's point. Don't start mentioning the rain unless you're ready to have it, because the whole point of mentioning it is a lead-in to the asking of it. Okay, so that's a way of seeing that the debate of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua in terms of this initial question of what's our frame of reference. Yes, though.
I have a very small question about Tosafot.
Yes.
Are you suggesting that when Tosafot introduces their comment with iname,
yes,
that I should read that as their primary bottom line position.
No,
I've
for
always read
Tosfos,
it like
Inami is an
majority.
equivalent. But I'm just saying that almost everybody assumes that that second answer
I
is
see.
the obvious answer, and the better answer.
Right, because they
Right, I
themselves
wasn't saying
are
it's
not
over.
saying we're
Right.
telling you it's the
Right.
it's the real answer.
Right. Now, I want to say another thing about this issue about Gevurot, and this is an important thing to think about Mashiach Baruch Marida Geshem in general. So, the idea of Gevurah and the linking to Maaseh Bereshit also here is an important question, right? By linking this to the idea of Gevurah and Maaseh Bereshit, it also takes it out of the framework of like, oh, please, we need the rain, and it's a lead into Bakasha. It's part of, just appreciating the wonders of creation and God's power in creating the world. And when we sort of see the rain, it just evokes for us against God's power in nature. And it's the part, like it's a religious response that's not in the context of, of the fact that we need this thing to happen and that it's a lead into the request. Again, it's a type of a more brachos orientation and a more general shavach, and not just a lead into the Tein Talumatar, a lead into the Bakasha. So although it was very convoluted how the Gemara here got Gevurah associated with rain, but again, I think by framing it in the context of Briyat HaOlam, it is important in terms of creating our frame of reference. One other thing I do want to say about this is, and this is worth mentioning, I think this is a point I read in Reuven Kimmelman. It's his argument, so if you don't like it, don't blame me. But it's quite fascinating. Well, you know what? I'm going to hold off on the point until we read the next line because it ties in more to the next line we're going to see. Yes.
Steinsaltz says note that Mary had a different order of the tractates, but he doesn't say what it was.
Okay, thank you. So now let's take a look at the Gemara. It says like this. Okay, no. Uminolon de bitfilah. How do you know you're supposed to say Mashi Baruch Marida Geshem in prayer? That it belongs in prayer. So now you could have said, I saw somebody who commented, well, why don't we say like it says by Shlomo? If there's no rain, they'll pray to you. But the point here is no. That's if there's like a tragedy or an impending tragedy. There's no rain. How do you know you say it just on an ongoing basis, even when everything is going the right way, that you're supposed to mention God's power in bringing the rain?
That's Lahazkir.
Okay, Lahazkir. Titania, we taught in the Breita, La'avat Hashem Elokeichem u'avdo b'chol vavchem. So somebody mentioned this, right? The connection of mitzvot to rain. Ezu yavoda shi b'leiv, which is the avod in the heart, la'avdo b'chol vavchem. So in your hearts, have yomer zot tefillah. It's prayer. That's an important idea about prayer, that it's described as avoda shebelev, service of the heart. But that's not something I'm going to unpack fully now. But la'avdo b'chol vavchem is prayer. V'ksiv basrei v'nasatim et artzachem be'ito yerel malkosh. I will give the rain in its time, the early rain and the late rain. So you see the idea of God giving the rain is connected to serving God in prayer, and therefore we should be mentioning it in prayer. Now, this, I think, by the way, again, also noting the idea that it's not just when bad things happen and calling out to God because there's a tragedy, is, again, extremely important in terms of appreciating, like, the religious mindset that I think Chazal were aiming at and was, I think, more true, in the time when they were so dependent on the vicissitudes of nature. Somebody once said the reason that it's so hard in high school for the kids to get into davening is because you're asking them to pray for things they don't need in a language they don't understand to a God they don't believe in. So
things always detailed.
Anyway, so the point is, if you are living in an agricultural society, you are, I don't know, but it's quite possible, depending on maybe how successful you are and where it is that you're living, but it's quite possible that sense of precariousness about your general, situation in life and your sense of dependency. We might feel precarious now, but it's like, where am I going to get a job? I might get fired, and it doesn't sort of point us to God necessarily. But if your precariousness has to do with the natural events and rain, and think about it, rain comes from above, right? And comes down from above, and it gives life, that sense of dependency on God for our life and our sustenance is much more, hopefully, in the forefront. And therefore, the idea that not just when bad things are happening, but la'avdo b'chol levavchem, to serve God with your whole heart, means that acknowledgement of you do mitzvot v'nasati gishmechem. So the way almost you reflect it, the serving of God with your heart is a constant acknowledgement about God as the one who is providing rain, our dependency on rain, our dependency on God. This is tied into our living a life of mitzvot and doing the right things, right? That's like a profound religious mindset, right? You're constantly conscious about how your life of following God and doing the mitzvot, determines whether God will be providing for you and you'll be getting rain, and is part of, and so it's something that sort of really, I think, is very, very powerful. It's not just a tiny point like, oh, it says rain and it says tefillah, so we should mention rain in tefillah. I think, again, the fact that rain is dependent on mitzvot, and that, so number one, the basic response to mitzvot that the Torah says is rain, right? If you do the mitzvot, you get rain. If you don't, you don't. So that's shows how much this is the very essence of yours, of life, is having the rain. And so if you really believe that, right, that's very powerful. Then everything you do matters and is going to determine whether you will be provided for or not, and whether there'll be rain or not. And therefore that's reflected in your religious mindset of your tefillah, and your prayers of b'chol levavchem are reflecting that type of an ongoing mindset. So I think that, again, that's very powerful in terms of thinking about the religious mindset that is at work here. And it's not just like a hint, oh, you mention it in rain, you mention it in davening. That this, again, reflects this pervasive, this very thoroughgoing religious mindset. Okay, yes?
Two quick questions. Is this where the service of the heart and prayer is first mentioned?
Yeah, it's not here. I mean, it occurs only here. It comes up in many places. But like in Midrashei Tanaim, I think in the Sifrei and so on, it's it's an earlier Tanaitic source. But this is definitely one of the mentions of it. Yes.
And the other question is, we're talking about rain in terms of location, like in Eretz Israel, rain is coming from above.
Right.
In other locations, Egypt or maybe Babylon, where the water is coming through the
Right.
Rivers,
Right.
flooding.
Right.
So is there a different?
So I think there is, and I think like the Psukim say, like when it says that Eretz Yisrael is Eretz Mitzrayim he, right? This is dependent on rain. So the fact that it's dependent on rain, shifts profoundly. If you have a predictable Nile that floods, then it's not the same degree of this precariousness and dependence on God. If you don't know whether it'll be raining, and again, just geographical, just sort of physically, the rain is coming and the life source is coming from above, it creates a very profound, different religious mindset.
That's a huge
right.
piece of biblical theology.
I think that's absolutely true. So the contrast to Mitzrayim, and the contrast that therefore God is looking at Israel and determining whether it's going to rain, and that there's involvement of God, and if you do the mitzvot you'll get rain, and if not. I mean, right? That's like the theology that runs. Right, and they desperately needed it. Right.
If there was drought there, if the flooding didn't come,
right,
in the same predicament.
That's true.
It's a different relationship.
But that is true. Right, but it's not. I don't think it leads to as much of the same type of religious mindset that the Gemara is talking about. Right.
Yeah.
Like I said, you might get fired from your job, but that doesn't mean that you're thinking about it in terms of God. Right. So there are bad things that can happen, but are you orienting towards God or not? So yes. So again, all of this is very clear and very much the religious theology. Right. It's all going to be determined by your mitzvot. It's all about God and God's connection to the land, and therefore the idea that it's central to things to being mentioned in prayer, right, on an ongoing basis, at least during the time when it's relevant, is therefore, and again, this is not just about praying for it in terms of because it might not happen, it's about that ongoing religious mindset. Okay, so now we have two things mentioned about the rain. Number one, the relationship to Briyat Olam and Gvura, and number two, this aspect about the ongoing sense of mitzvot and their connection to rain and your religious connection sort of to God. So now the Gemara continues. Okay. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Says Rabbi Yochanan. Gimel maftichot biyado shel hakadosh baruch hu. And this, I think, heightens this point. By the way, it's interesting to note that you got a lot of Rabbi Yochanan in the first parak, and a lot of Amoraim from Eretz Yisrael, much more than Amoraim from Bavel. And again, this might have something to do with the reality of the need for rain and so on. So that's just worth noticing. Okay, so God said there are three keys. Rabbi Yochanan said there are three keys given in the hands of God. Shalonim shru biyad shliach, that God doesn't give over to any person. God directly controls them. The Eluhain, these are they. Mafteach shel Geshamim, the key of rain. Umafteach shel Chaya, the key of childbirth. Umafteach shel Tchiyat HaMeitim, and the key of resurrection. Mafteach shel Geshamim, the one of rain, Tichsiv. Yiftach Hashem l'chat otzaro atov et hashamayim latet metar tzcha b'ito. God should open up for you His warehouse, the heavens, to give the rain, to give the rain at the right time. Mafteach shel Chaya, childbirth, minayin Tichsiv. Vayiskor Elokim et Rachel, God remembered Rachel. Vayishma Eleh Elokim, God heard her. Vayiftach et Rachma, and opened up her womb. Mafteach shel Tchiyat HaMeitim minayin. D'chsiv, the verse says, V'yidatem ki ani Hashem, you'll know that I'm God, b'pitchi et kivrotechem, when I open up your graves. Now, one thing to notice here, two things to notice. Number one is in all three of these things, it says the verb pateach, b'pitchi, vayiftach, yiftach. So mafteach, the key, exactly is the word in the verse of pticha, of open. Number two is, I think the Maharsha asks, why didn't you quote the pasuk by Leah, where it says God opened up her womb, which occurs earlier than Rachel? And he said they wanted a pasuk where the God's name was immediately juxtaposed to the word vayiftach. And in all these three things, it says Vayishma Eleha Elohim vayiftach, right? Ani Hashem b'pitchi. In all three of them, not only is it the idea that God opens it up, but it's immediately juxtaposed, and that's the idea. God directly controls this. There's nothing between God and the opening up. So the pasuk by Leah wasn't immediately juxtaposed, and they want to emphasize this is all God's control. So again, the point here being, I think, a couple-fold. Number one is that this is, directly about God's involvement in the earth. Like if you think about a shaliach, an intermediary, there are reasons it doesn't rain. There's, natural, meteorological, reasons, other explanations. To some degree, God is involved, but, that's not the immediate cause. The Gemara doesn't want you thinking like that, right? The Gemara wants you thinking that these are things like Einei Hashem Elokecha Ba, like the pasuk that was quoted earlier, that God is directly involved in, and therefore your sort of prayer to God or your relationship to God, and is direct. It has a direct impact. Like you should interpret this directly as something coming from God, or the absence as directly a problem between you and God, and that also relates to then how you respond to God when these things, when it's going good and also when it's going bad. So basically, the message is that this is the central way that God or a central way that God is relating to us on this earth, and that therefore that we connect to God. The presence of it, the absence of it, God is directly involved. That's point number one. Obviously the rain point, but then the other 2 points are, the point of life, right? God brings life into existence, childbirth, and the resurrection. And that obviously evokes the idea that rain is central to our life, right? Rain, we need water and we need sustenance and the crops and so on. And to be seeing all three of these things as, again, God is directly involved, because all of these are directly about God, about sustaining our life, or creating or creating new life, or bringing new life, or resurrecting. And that just ties into the third point of the Gemara. Let's take a look, the final point, which is B'Marava Amri, in Eretz Yisrael they say, which is funny because Rabbi Yochanan's from Eretz Yisrael, Amri, Af Mafteach Shel Parnasai, even the general livelihood, not related to rain. Okay, although there it doesn't have God's name juxtaposed with Pticha. Rabbi Yochanan, my time, why isn't he including that? It's essentially the same. I mean, if you're an agricultural society, what represents your Parnasa is Geshamim. But of course, by abstracting it to Parnasa, you lose some of the punch, right? Because by abstracting it to Parnasa, it's more abstract. God's involved in our livelihood. Rain, is again, it says, Ki kasher yetzei, what is it? Ki kasher yered ageshem min hashamayim, v'shama lo yashuv, the same way the rain comes from heaven, my word comes down. The imagery of the rain, the water is life, and, is much more concrete and immediate and felt, and therefore it doesn't always help to abstract it. There's a power to be thinking about this as God is directly involved here. Now, I want to say another thing, which is there's another place where we link Geshamim to Tchiyat HaMeitim, which is where? Where else do we link other than the psukim here that they're in the hands of God? Well, we say it in Shemon Esrei, right? The whole bracha, Atah Gibor Le'olam Hashem, right? Mechayei Meitim Atah Rav Lo'ushia, Mashiv Haruach U'Marid HaGeshem. Right? So anyway, it's all linked together. Now,
sorry.
Now, this is the point I wanted to say that Rabbi Kimmelman says. I mean, the normal way of thinking about it is it's a bracha of Tchiyat HaMeitim, but we somehow abstracted a little bit to be about Gevurah, and therefore, rain also fits there because it's about life, and like we said, like this Midrash sort of indicates, it's similar. It's about giving life, so we'll throw it there as well. But basically, it's a bracha of Tchiyat HaMeitim. What Rabbi Kimmelman said in an article I read is he suggests, I'm trying to remember if I'm accurately remembering this, but I think he suggests something along those lines, but like with a twist. He says that by inserting the idea of Geshamim into that bracha, what we're actually doing is trying to make the idea of Tchiyat HaMeitim more persuasive. Because if you recognize God's power as bringing down the water, and what is it like? Like the world looks dead, things are buried in the ground, water comes down, and things that were buried in the ground now sprout to life. So you see in your own day-to-day existence how the rain that comes from God brings about a type of a Tchiyat HaMeitim, and therefore, that then makes the whole idea of Tchiyat HaMeitim something that you can really, believe in and relate to, and concretizes it. So he actually sort of sees this as part of making Tchiyat HaMeitim more persuasive. Not, that's why it's sort of being placed here, to concretize that idea. And again, I think that that's powerful in the way Rabbi Yochanan is also bringing these ideas together. Yes?
I was just saying, that's all Parak Bet of Bereshit. All of creation sprouts from the ground, starting with human beings, once it's water.
Right. Excellent. Yeah.
There seemed to have been some Nevi'im who were given keys.
So Tosos asked that question. I'm not going to get into unpacking that. But the other thing I did want to say about that, though, was that, yes, these are directly in the hands of God, the keys, but how do we get God to use the keys? It's because, as I was reading somebody last night who discussed this, he says, the mafteach is in the hand of God. But the mafteach to the mafteach is in the hands of humans, right? So Rachel cries out, and therefore God opens, right? You observe the mitzvot, and therefore God brings the rain. So in the end, it's in the hands of God, but that's ultimately in our hands, and that again gets to the idea that it's all about our direct relationship with God. Okay? So now the Gemara continues. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Miyom Tov HaRishon Shel Chag. So you start saying it on the first day of Sukkot, and Rabbi Yoshua says only after the last day. Yibayelu. Rabbi Eliezer Mehechel Gomer La. Where does Rabbi Eliezer get the idea that you start saying it on the first day? Milulav Gomer La, from lulav, which is connected to water, as we'll see. O Minisa Chamayim Gomer La, or from the pouring of water that you also did on Sukkot. So what's the difference? Milulav Gomer La, if he learns out the idea that Sukkot is a time of rain from lulav, so Ma Lulav Biyom Afaskar Biyom. So the same way lulav starts the first day of Sukkot, you start saying according to him, Mashi Baruch Moed Geshem, on the first day, but not the night before. Or maybe he learns it out from Nisuk Hamayim. Ma Nisuk Hamayim mi'orta, but Nisuk Hamayim could, in theory, although we do Nisuk Hamayim in the morning, could, in theory, begin the night before. The Amar Mar we teach, the mincha and their nesachim, afilu b'layla, that when you bring a mincha nesachim of a korban, you could do it at night. Now that's not exactly relevant, because that's you bring the korban at day, and you can finish it up with the mincha and the nesachim at night. But since nisuach, pouring libations, can be done at night, so therefore, in theory, Tosa says, it's again not agreed that this is what the Gemara means, but Tosa says it means that in theory we could begin the Nisuk Hamayim at night as well. Rashi doesn't like that conclusion. Rashi just says the process begins at night. We do the whole Simchas Beis HaShoeva at night. Mm-hmm. Okay, but anyway, if it's Nisuk Hamayim, it more already begins the night before. And therefore, Afaskar Me'ort, if that's your source, then we should start saying Mashi Varuach, according to him, the night of the first night of Sukkot. So Toshma, so come in here. The Amar Rabbi Avo says, Lo Lamda Rabbi Eliezer Elam Milulav. Rabbi Eliezer learned it from Lulav, so he would only have you start saying it the first day of Sukkot. Igadamri, some say Rabbi Avo Gemara Gamir La, that he had as a tradition, that was Rabbi Eliezer's source. The Igadamri, some say Masnisa Shmialei. He actually had a Breita that indicated this. Mahi, what's the Breita? Titania, we taught in the Breisa. Me'emasai Maskir Nal Geshamim. When do you mention the rain? Rabbi Eliezer Omer Mishas Nitilat Lulav. So he's very explicit. From the time you begin taking the Lulav, Rabbi Yeshua Omer Mishat Hanachato, only after you place it down, only after you're done with the Lulav, only starting on Shmini Atzeret. Amar Rabbi Eliezer said, Look, The whole idea of the lulav is that they're coming as a type of a prayer for the rain. I mean, these are things that grow on the water, and we shake it, and all of we assume that the idea, you could ask what is the point of lulav, but it's reasonable to assume, and he assumes that it's a type of a prayer for rain. So, the same way that they need water, and they represent the fact that, how things depend on water. The world can't exist without water. I mean, that's what's implicit in our taking of the lulav. We're saying to God, look, God, these are living things. They depend on water. We depend on water. Please make sure that we have water this coming year. So he says, if you start taking lulav, you should start saying, Mashi Baruch Morida Geshem. Amalo Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua said to him, what are you talking about? If it rains on Sukkot, that's a bad thing. So, Amalo Rabbi Eliezer said back, I agree you don't want it right now, but so you don't ask for it, but you begin mentioning it. You want to sort of start the process. And the same way you mentioned Tchias HaMeisim, which is what the whole focus of that bracha is, the whole year. But that will come in its right time. So, you mentioned it the whole year. And you only want them in the right time. Now, he said, what do you mean the whole year? I thought you said starting on the first day of Sukkot. So now he's going to tell you. He said, and therefore I would say, yeah, you want to say Mashi Baruch Morida Geshem the whole year? Because when the hate. It's part of recognizing God's power, and it's appropriate for Tchiyat HaMeitim, even if it's not the time. Now, Tosfos points out that there's a difference. He says, if you want to say it the whole year, you may, but you are obligated to start saying it on the first day of Sukkot, when it is beginning to be the rainy season. So he's saying, look, I agree you don't start asking for it yet, because because asking for it is only when you're really ready for it to come. But because it's now the rainy season, you start mentioning, and mentioning is not the same as asking, because you could really mention it the whole year if you wanted to. So the fact that you could do it the whole year makes it clear that it's not the same as asking. That it's start praising God and God's power and acknowledging God's power, and that's what it is. But so therefore you can do it the whole year, but you're obligated to do it when it's the appropriate time, when it's the rainy season. But even when you do it, it doesn't mean that you're asking for it yet. It means that you're mentioning it because it's the time of rain. The asking for it will come later. That's Rabbi Eliezer's position. Let's just see what Rabbi Yoshua says back. So he says, okay, Rabbi Omer. So we don't have Rabbi Yoshua's response. Now we have Rabbi, and Rabbi says a variation or a defense of Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Omer. Rabbi says, Omer ani. I say, Mishak shemafsik l'she'ela. When you stop asking, Tein Talum Matar, you don't say Tein Talum Matar after the first day of Pesach. Kach mafsik lahazkara. You have to stop saying Mashi Baruch Morida Geshem. So what Rabbi is saying is, I don't agree with what you said, Rabbi Eliezer. You're not allowed to say Mashi Baruch Morida Geshem during the rest of the year, and therefore you're not allowed to say it at the beginning of Sukkot if it's not the time. I do not believe that you can have this as a general shevach. It's very much tied in to bakasha. So again, I think that this is, like we said when we began it, this is, I think, the debate. Rabbi Eliezer says, I am prepared to see this as a general shevach. A general shevach, in theory, you could say the whole year. You have to say it when it's the season, but in theory, you could say it the whole year. But it's not an implicit tie-in to asking for it, even when you say it on Sukkot. Whereas Rebbe and Rabbi Yoshua are saying, no, this is all tied into Tein Talum Matar. You stop saying it when you stop saying Tein Talum Matar. So when you begin saying it, it's a lead into Tein Talum Matar. And therefore, you don't start saying it when it's not yet when you're not yet ready for it. Okay. So, and now we have Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer. I'm sorry, where are we?
That's it. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, okay. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer b'sheni b'chag hu maskir agrees to Rabbi Eliezer's idea that it's tied into it's in the middle of Sukkot, not at the end. But he says it's only on the second day of Sukkot, and we'll see because he believes that the Nisuch HaMayim, it's tied to the Nisuch HaMayim, and the Nisuch HaMayim, according to him, only began on the second day of Sukkot. Rabbi Akiva Omer b'shishi b'chag hu maskir, because Rabbi Akiva also says it's tied into the Nisuch HaMayim, but for him that began on the 6th of Sukkot. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Yoshua Omer. Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Yoshua says, and this is Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah, Ha'over lifnei ateva b'yom tov ha'achron shel Chag, that on the last day of Sukkot, meaning on Shmini Atzeret, ha'achron mazkir, the Baal Musaf says it, ha'rishon eino mazkir, the Baal Shachris does not say it. Beyond of Rishon Shel Pesach, the first day of Sukkot of Pesach, Harishon Mazkir, Ha'acharon eino mazkir. It's the reverse. The first guy says it, the Baal Shachris, the Baal Musaf already does not say it. Okay, so that's all the whole range of positions. Let's just read a little bit more in the Gemara. So Shaper Kamerle Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua. So Rabbi Eliezer's response to Rabbi Yoshua was a good one. So if Tchias HaMeisim means when it's the right time, so why can't Mashiv Aruch HaMorid HaGeshem mean when it's the right time? So Amalach Rabbi Yoshua will say back to you, no. You know, we'd love to have Tchias HaMeisim any day. So it might not come until it's the right time, but any day we're ready for it. El Gushamim, but rain, do you think any time it rains would be a good thing? V'hatnan, we teach later, Yotza Nisan, once Nisan is out, V'yard Gushamim, and it rains, Siman Klolahain. It's bad to have rain in the wrong time. Shene Emar, Halok Tzirchitimaya. So, and the pasuk sort of indicates that it's not the time for rain. So therefore, it's an obvious difference. Tchias HaMeisim, we want it any time. Rain, even if you're mentioning God's Gvura, you actually don't want it certain times, and therefore you should not be mentioning it. Okay? So there is this debate, but again, I think it's anchored in the issue of whether you think Mashiv Aruch HaMorid HaGeshem is fundamentally Shavach, or is it ultimately just a tie-in and a lead-in to Tein Talumat Livracha? So tomorrow we'll unpack the issue about second day or sixth day, but I want to say one other final point before we end, which is the idea, and I'll say this again, but the idea of going from Pesach through Sukkot without saying it. You know, I was reading an article last night by this person, Rabbi Dov Berkowitz, not the same as Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz, Rabbi Eliezer who was Niftar a good number of years ago. Anyway, Rabbi Dov Berkowitz, who points out like the interesting thing again in terms of like the religious mindset. He says, think about it. All the times we have Yomim Tovim, we don't have Mashiv Aruch HaMorid HaGeshem. We only have Mashiv Aruch HaMorid HaGeshem during like the dead time of the year, the time when there's no Yomim Tovim, right? You're like, I mean, okay, you get it at the very end, you know, you get it at the like very last day, or very end of Shmini, very beginning, but ultimately it's during the time when there's no Yomim Tovim. And he sort of says, look, he says, during the period of the Yomim Tovim, from Nisan through Sukkot, that's the time when you are out and working in the fields. You're harvesting, you know, you're plowing, you're planting, or whatever. That's when you're doing all of your human activity. And therefore, one of the themes of the Chagim is to direct that human activity and that sort of bringing the stuff in and direct it to God, right? To acknowledge, you know, that Pesach is the time of barley, and Shavuos is the time of wheat, and the time of Bikurim, and you bring the Bikurim, and you say, God gave me these things, and Sukkot, you bring in all the harvest, and Smachta Lifnei Hashem HaKavod. So it's to take all of that human endeavor and to put it in a religious context and sort of like to acknowledge God, and that's all achieved by the Chagim. He says, in the period from Sukkot to Pesach, there's very little human endeavor. You basically have done the planting, and now you're just waiting for the rain, right? So it's not like, oh, I'm going to think it's all my doing. It's actually a time period of the year where you very much are not doing much and are acknowledging it's all dependent on God. So therefore, he says, so that gets filled, that sort of acknowledgement, with the Mashiv Aruch HaMorid HaGeshem, you know, sort of with that acknowledgement, like it's all about prayer and waiting for God to sort of, you know, to do God's part, or calling on God. But that's sort of the religious reality there. Whereas on the other time, it's very much your activity, and you have to sort of take that activity and translate it in a way that acknowledges God. So, you know, you bring the Bikurim, you share with your harvest to the Ani, the Ger, and the Yatom. You know, you take the Lulav and the Esrog, Usmachta Lifnei Hashem Elokechem. So you take that activity and you give to, you know, and you direct it towards God. Whereas here it's much more of a passive period, and a period of like just sort of like more silent dependency, where it translates in terms of prayer and, you know, waiting for God for the rains to come. So I think that's like a very, it's out of our hands. It's out of our hands. So I think that was really powerful for me to think about like the different, you know, sort of ways of being during the different times of the years and the different type of like religious response that's appropriate. Okay, so to be continued tomorrow.
Rabbi,
Yes.
do you see any connection between the Haggadah